In about 2 weeks, churches all across America are going to celebrate Easter. We'll sing about the resurrection. We'll talk about the empty tomb. We'll celebrate that Christ is risen, but something interesting often happens. Many Easter messages talk about the resurrection, but very few sit with what actually led to the crucifixion. Yes, the Romans carried out the execution, and yes, they nailed Jesus to the cross. But when you read the Gospels carefully, something else becomes clear. Jesus didn't die just because of Rome. He died because of a religious system that saw him as a threat. And if you've ever found yourself on the wrong side of leadership in a religious institution, you may already understand that story a little more than you realize. Let's slow it down and look carefully at the story. Jesus wasn't crucified for being mistaken. He was crucified because his actions disrupted the existing system. He healed on the Sabbath. Instead of celebrating the healing, some leaders began discussing on how they could stop him. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, people the religious structure had labeled unclean. He spoke with a Samaritan woman at the well, someone several social systems said did not matter. Over and over again, Jesus chose to restore dignity to people who had been pushed to the margins, and that created a problem. Because if outsiders are welcome, if broken people can approach God, if people can experience healing and grace without the institution acting as the gatekeeper, then the structure begins to lose control. Eventually, the tensions escalated and religious leaders started accusing Jesus of blasphemy. Political leaders viewed Jesus as a threat to their stability. And together, those pressures led to the cross. The ones who were supposed to shepherd the people handed him over to the one who was actually feeding them. They handed the one over who was actually feeding them. And this is where the story begins to feel familiar to many of us, because sometimes the same pattern shows up. Different century, different institutions, similar dynamics. And to be fair, every institution, not just churches, struggles with the tension between protecting structure and protecting people. When someone raises difficult questions and is told simply to submit or be quiet, when authority or spiritual authority is used to silence dissent, when harm happens inside a church or a system, and the system protects the leadership instead of the wounded, something in that pattern echoes the story of Jesus. Jesus wasn't condemned because he lied, he was condemned because he spoke truth in a system that had grown comfortable with its power. Jesus challenged the idea that God could only be accessed through approved channels. Jesus challenged the assumption that authority automatically equaled righteousness. And those challenges made people uncomfortable. 2,000 years later, churches display crosses everywhere, but sometimes we forget what that cross originally represented: execution and death. As a therapist who works with people navigating spiritual trauma, I see this dynamic often. People who love their church, people who serve faithfully, people who gave their time, their energy, their money, their trust, and then something happened. They asked a question. They named a concern. They saw something that didn't feel quite right to them. And suddenly that community began to turn against them. not always because they were wrong, but sometimes just because they were inconvenient. What makes spiritual trauma unique is this. When a job harms us, we can say the workplace was unhealthy. But when a religious or spiritual system or church harms us, the pain is often wrapped in spiritual language. It's not just rejection, it feels like God rejected us as people. It's not just being silenced, it feels like God silenced us. The institution's voice often becomes confused with God's voice. And that creates what we like to call sacred betrayal. Sacred betrayal. The place that's supposed to nurture our faith becomes the place that wounds it. And if Easter or Resurrection Sunday stirs up complicated emotions, anger, sadness, numbness, that doesn't mean that your faith is failing. It just means that the nervous system in your body is actually remembering. Let me be clear about something. This is not a rejection of Easter or Resurrection Sunday because the resurrection is central to the Christian faith. But the resurrection makes sense or makes more sense when we remember what happened on Friday. Easter is not just about victory over death, it is also about vindication. Because the system called Jesus a blasphemer, but God called Jesus son. The system condemned Jesus to death, but God raised Jesus. And this matters for anyone who has been rejected by a religious institution while trying to live honestly before the Lord. The resurrection reminds us that institutions don't get the final word. God gets the final word. So this Easter, this Resurrection Sunday, whether you find yourself in a church pew or watching from home, remember the story. A man spoke truth. A system couldn't tolerate it, yet God raised him anyway. If you ever stood for truth in a place that didn't want to hear it, that just lets you know that you're in good company. Next week, I'm going to talk about something practical. What do you do when Easter is coming and you're not okay? Because some of us aren't. How do you move through the weekend with your dignity, with your faith, and with your sanity intact? Make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss it. And remember, most of all, to love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. Take care.